Greetings, everyone, and welcome to what I'm sure will be a fascinating event today on Du Bois and Cabral. My name is Yusuf Al-Balushi, and I teach in the Department of Global and International Studies here at the University of California, Irvine. Today's event is part of a year-long Sawyer seminar that's supported by the Mellon Foundation, and this year's seminar theme is Black Reconstruction as a Portal. And the idea of the seminar is basically to take up W.E.B. Du Bois's crucial study, Black Reconstruction in America, as a conduit to our present crisis. So that's the spirit in which today we have this wonderful conversation between Du Bois and Cabral. You can find more information about future events as well as recordings of past events on our website, blackreconstructionasaportal.org, or on Twitter at Reading Du Bois. I need to thank my comrade and co-director of the seminar, Damien Sojourner from UCI's Department of Anthropology. And we want to thank Melissa Valdez, Monica Rodriguez in the School of Social Sciences for all of their help organizing this event, as well as our Sawyer seminar team, our postdoctoral fellow, Marilyn Grell-Brisk, and our PhD student fellows, Temitope Famodu in Global Studies and Mariel Rowland in Culture and Theory. And we also want to thank Amanda Swain and Ekua Arhin in the UCI Humanities Center. Our wonderful moderator today is Chris Peterson, who is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine, and a research affiliate at the Institute of African and Diaspora Studies, jointly run by the University of Lagos and the University of the West Indies. She received her BS in aquatic biology from UC Santa Barbara, her MA in women's studies from San Francisco State University, and her PhD in anthropology from Rice University. She's the author of numerous articles and of the widely celebrated book, Speculative Markets, Drug Circuits, and Derivative Life in Nigeria, which is a fantastic, fantastic book. And she's also the co-author of the forthcoming The Ethnographer's Way, a handbook for multidimensional research design, I think coming out with Duke Press. It's going to be a wonderful resource for all of us that do research. So we're especially thankful that she's agreed to moderate this conversation today, and I'm now going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Yusuf. It's really wonderful to be here today. The Sawyer seminars, Black Construction as a Portal, has been such a fabulous resource this year at UCI, and really happy to be here with all of you across all of the time zones between Irvine and Johannesburg today. Before I introduce both of our speakers, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping and explain how the Q&A will work. So as you are welcome to use the chat to pose any questions that you have at any point in time during the discussion. Once we complete both the lecture and the discussion, I will call on people, or I'll just read your questions out loud and field it to our panelists, and then we'll just go from there. So I'll just moderate through the chat system. And so now I would like to introduce our speakers. Very excited today. We have António Tomás, who is giving our lecture, and Stephen Osuna, who will be providing discussant comments. Professor Tomás is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. He received his PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. He is the author of numerous articles and 2 books. Most recently, he published, which is part of his dissertation, In the Skin of the City, Spatial Transformation in Luanda, from Duke University Press, which is a historical ethnography of the city of Luanda that spans the 500-year period of modernity, from slavery and colonialism to the anti-colonial struggle, the post-colonial civil war, and the post-conflict eras of urbanization. I highly recommend this book. It is really fantastic. And he has recently published an English translation. He is actually the translator of his biography of Amílcar Cabral, entitled Amílcar Cabral, The Life of a Reluctant Nationalist, published by Hearst. And so we're very excited to be in dialogue about this book today. And we warmly welcome our discussant as well, Stephen Osuna, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Cal State University, Long Beach. He received his PhD in sociology with an emphasis in Black studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is a scholar of racism and political economy, globalization, transnationalism, and immigration, as well as policing and criminalization. His scholarship appears in journals such as Ethnicities, Race and Class, the Journal of World Systems Research, and the American Quarterly. He also has published book chapters in edited volumes such as U.S. Central Americans and The Futures of Black Radicalisms, in which he has a chapter engaging the work of Amílcar Cabral and Cedric Robinson entitled Class Suicide. Stephen was born and raised in Echo Park, Los Angeles, and is the son of Mexican and Salvadoran working class migrants. And with that, I am going to turn our discussion over to Professor Tomás, and Professor Osuna will then follow with his discussant comments. Thank you.
Good evening here in Johannesburg. It's 6 p.m. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you so much, Chris, for the generous presentation. And thanks, Stephen, to be here and to provide comments on my work. So I'm gonna read for 40 minutes. I didn't have any images to show because this piece is, theoretical, historical, and so please bear with me. I'm going to speak for 40 minutes and then we can start the discussion. I hope to be able to read much of what I have here. So the title of the presentation is from Web Du Bois to Cabral, Portuguese Africa and the Colonies. So let me start. For the second meeting of the Third Pan-African Congress in 1923, William Edward Booker Du Bois traveled to Lisbon to meet with leaders of organizations working for the advancement of African interests in the Portuguese Empire. Among the many activists he came to be acquainted with, José Magalhães caught his attention. Du Bois mentions him in a few of his essays, such as in the opening of his famous Words of Color, in which he writes, quote, "You see Magalhães," to give him the Portuguese spelling, "is a mulatto, small, light brown, and his hand quick with gesture," end of quote. We also know through Du Bois that Magalhães was a medical doctor, a practicing specialist at the Institute of Tropical Medicine, and a deputy representing Saint Tomé in the Portuguese Parliament. Furthermore, Du Bois also points out that José Magalhães' social prominence was not an isolated case in Portugal, that there were other Black holding similar positions, and that hundreds of African students were enrolled in Portuguese universities. According to Du Bois' views on racial relations in Portugal, quote, "Between the Portuguese and the African and Neo-African, there is naturally no racial, no accumulated historical hatred, dislike, despisings. Not that you would likely find a Black man married to a Portuguese of family or wealth. But on the other hand, it seems quite natural for Portugal to make all the Black of her African empire citizens of Portugal with the rights of the European-born. Allow me to emphasize this. Citizens of Portugal with the right of European-born. For the status of this category of people during and after colonialism is part of what I will be speaking about today. In the same piece, Words of Color, in his typical style, Du Bois proceeds to provide the structural reasons behind this presence of Blacks in Portuguese society. With the end of formal slavery in the previous centuries, he intimates, white Portuguese producers of cocoa in Africa, particularly on the island of São Tomé, resorted to practice of labor akin to slavery to accrue and protect their profit margins. Because of these producers found themselves under a great deal of pressure. The cocoa industry was, quote, the cocoa industry was forced by public opinion to boycott Portuguese cocoa. The great Portuguese proprietors were forced to give place to smaller Negroes and mulattoes cultivators who could afford smaller profits, end of quote. For Du Bois, these pressures and boycotts contribute to the diminishing of profit margins, which discourage white Portuguese from investing in cocoa production and open the way for Black Portuguese to take it up, thus improving their social standing in the Portuguese Empire. Words of Color was written more than 10 years before the publication of Du Bois' masterwork, Black Reconstruction in America. However, in Words of Color and in a few other essays penned around the same time, the thinking and the argumentative scaffolding that would later allow Du Bois to challenge the main tenets of the literature of the American Reconstruction is clearly discernible. The ways in which Du Bois set up the problem is worth recalling here. Quote, was the rule of the mass of Americans to be unlimited and the right to rule extend to all men, regardless of race, color, or if not, what power of the dictatorship would rule and how would property and privilege be protected? This was the great and the primary question which was in the minds of the man who wrote the Constitution of the United States and continued in the minds of thinkers down through the slavery controversy. It still remains with the world as the problem of democracy expands and touches all races and nations, end of quote. By framing the problem of democracy in America and the world in such a way, Du Bois provide fodder for what a few decades earlier, he saw as the main challenge of modern times. Very famously, he said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The question of the relationship between democracy and race is still worth asking, as I'm doing today, particularly in relation to the accomplishment and fate of Black diasporic communities in much of the Western world. In the remainder of this presentation, I will evoke the American experience or the American exceptional experience to shed light on the relationship between the universalization of democracy and the stubbornness of the color line that inevitably cuts across it. I will do so by bringing to my analysis the revolutionary practice of the Ghanaian-born Africanist Amílcar Cabral. My point here is not to compare or find any sort of resemblance or commonality between, on one hand, Du Bois' work and action, and on the other, Cabral's revolutionary theory, which underpin his quest for self-determination, although there is common ground between them. My ambition in this piece is more modest, for I believe that engaging with the theoretical and sometimes unresolved concerns Du Bois grappled with in much of his life can yield insight into Cabral's practical and philosophical challenges. Here, I'm particularly concerned with the question of the extent to which Du Bois' interpretation of an engagement with his time allow us to understand the world in which Cabral crafted his revolutionary practice. Discussing the later writing of Du Bois, Eric Porter makes the important argument that there is something about the reconstruction of the US that begs an understanding of the reconstruction of Europe in the post-World War II. As he emphatically writes, quote, "The problem of the reconstruction of the United States in 1886 is the problem of the reconstruction of the world in 1943, end of quote. I agree with Porter in general terms, but one cannot fail to notice the tendency in the broad field of American studies to use the history of the United States to make sense of the rest of the world. It is perhaps not enough to say, as Porter has, that Du Bois has already understood that advancement and liberation in America was intimately interlocked with advancement and progress in the rest of the world. The question here becomes, to what extent was an engagement with the world history or an engagement with the Negro problem in much of the world fundamental in Du Bois' attempts to rectify the American history of Reconstruction? On this, I will have to say more later. This fascination with oral history, or this reading of world events from the standpoint of the US, speaks to the moment in which the United States was called to play a larger role in global politics in the aftermath of World War II. Hence, perhaps, the amount of studies and literature concerning the United States in that period that have even or particularly come from the Black studies perspective. However, to offer a more accurate historical background for what I'm attempting to do in this presentation, it is perhaps more productive to evoke an earlier historical period, the period between the wars. Of importance in that historical period is the notion of empire and the kinds of political possibilities being gauged, for instance, on the forms of association between empire and the colonized people, which were irrevocably superseded with the triumph of the nation state as the chief way by which the interplay between sovereignty and belonging is organized. Engaged with empire provides a vantage point from which to come to terms with the formation of the transformation, with the formation and the transformation of concepts such as democracy, equality, and self-determination, particularly in the context of a progressive and undeniable human diversity. To put it differently, it is in the context of the empire, the American empire, and its correspondent European empires, as a dominant political framework that the question of what, for a lack of a better term, I would call negative democracy came to the fore. My usage of the term negative democracy stems from the ways in which Du Bois so cogently posed political power as the means through which the distribution of property is arbitrated, on the one hand, and the conservation of property and privilege takes place on the other. As such, I would like to argue that some of the unresolved business of democracy resides in the tension between the dying empire and the emerging nation state. As I will show, this cuts through the time and struggles of Amílcar Cabral's generation, and for the most part, the struggle of Black Portuguese in post-colonial present-day Portugal. By the time Du Bois was visiting a Black activist in 1923, the Portuguese Empire was going through the kind of reconstruction America went through after the Civil War. And these sorts of processes speak to the kind of problems any empire in the world faces: how to expand the empire by incorporate territory and diverse subjects, and how to do so without significant change at the center of power. These are some of the questions that, for instance, Mahmoud Mamdani grappled with in citizen subject. Mamdani's answer to this question was indirect rule, which the British, the French, and the Portuguese practiced in Africa. For for it always comes down to how to make democracy works in a plural and diverse political environment. In indirect rule, the bifurcation of the state implies the partition of the polity, so that two opposite realms for political action can emerge. On one hand, civil, or more aptly called Mandani, civilized society, and on the other, the native authority. Even though the case of Portuguese colonialism is far more nuanced and complex than Mandani's classifications, there are still lessons to be learned from this clear-cut duality. With the expansion of Portuguese colonial administration in Africa, particularly after Portugal became a republic in 1910, there came the problem of ascription of rights to the dominated people. It was far easier when the privilege in the colonized society could be counted in the hundreds, as Du Bois noted, but things became more difficult when the number were larger. The Portuguese resolved these questions of right and privilege less through the politicization of culture, through the formation of native administration, seems to imply, and more through the inscription of labor in the political realm. Portuguese native law, the so-called Lei do Indigenato, was less concerned with ethnic or tribal ascription than with the need to create a category of human beings, the native, subject to labor conscription. This legal system, which I will be called in Portuguese, indigenato, rather than merely native law, defines the indigena, so the native, as the individual devoid of the qualities determined necessary to partake in civil society, and defines labor as the conditions through which he could transcend the limitation of his condition. Coming to terms with conceptual refinements in the spirit of Du Bois' writing, according to Porter, amounts to paying attention to, quote, how European colonialism, US imperialism, and white supremacy in general were maintained through a complex yet complementary system of affirmations and disallows of race, through a multitude of social structure and different modes of race knowledges, end of quote. In the 1920s, the period when Du Bois visited Portugal, Portuguese colonial thinkers were coming to terms with the kind of society that produced individuals such as José Magalhães. As such, one may say, Cabral was the product of the limitations and the curtailments faced by the preceding generation, the generation of his father, Juvenal Cabral, who were deeply and severely affected by this transformation, that is, by the coming to being of the indigenato and the legal and constitutional bifurcation in the empire. It was during the Republic, the democratic regime that preceded fascism in Portugal, that the indigenato came into being. For the Portuguese colonial empire, the promulgation of the indigenato was carried out with Angola and Mozambique, and not so much São Tomé, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau in mind, for two reasons. First, as I have mentioned, the need to create a category of population from which labor could be extracted without or with very little remuneration. Secondly, the need to segregate as much as possible the populations based on race, particularly because Angola and Mozambique would become the recipients of largest number of Portuguese settlers. As the Portuguese administration expanded, particularly after the end of the Republic in the 1910s, Portuguese settlers came to occupy the middle strata, which was in competition with those Africans whose family had prospered with the slave trade and who considered themselves as a sort of nobility by virtue of being, in some cases, descendants of Europeans. Those Africans could speak and write perfectly in Portuguese and could wrestle in their elegant prose with the fragilities of the Portuguese Empire. But they were for reforms from within rather than succession from the empire. This generation's mentality is well captured in the writings of Juvenal Cabral, the father of Amílcar Cabral, who in one of his books admonished his children for speaking Creole instead of Portuguese, dubbed by a contemporary of South African Mário Pinto Andrade, the proto-nationalist generation. Dubbed by a contemporary of Cabral, Mário Pinto Andrade, the proto-nationalist generation, Juvenal's generation believed in transformative force of education and advocated for its universalization. They were aware of and very sensitive to racism and racial discrimination, but they were, for the most part, inclined to believe in the need for reforms within the space of Portugal domination, rather than an uncoupling from it. The rupture with colonialism, Amílcar Cabral, and people such as Mário Pinto de Andrade propose can be seen as a reflection of the failure of empire to accommodate diversity by reducing the space of civil society and raising the stakes for membership in it. The point to consider here is the extent to which indigenato crept into the lives and aspirations not only of those the law was meant to regulate, but also those assimilados who consider themselves Black Portuguese and navigate practically and symbolically between the African and European world. For them, since the implantation of the indigenato in the 1920s, the indigenato became not only a category they could fall into, but also a class formed by those they were increasingly forced to live with, particularly in the context of the enforcement of zoning rules in urban centers that separated settlers from natives. Laws promulgated in the 1920s determined the places Black, natives, and assimilados alike could build their houses. In Luanda, Angola, for instance, the valuation of primary commodities such as cotton and coffee ushered in new waves of white migration and triggered economic speculation in land and landed property, the indirect consequence of which was that those proud members of the so-called Creole society lost the right to the city and were left to find and build their houses in the newly formed slums. Cabral's father was a member of this generation. These experiences are not unique to Lusophone Africa. Anyone who has read Du Bois' talented tenth is perhaps familiar with such description. Quote, "Is it fair, is it decent, is it Christian to ignore this fact of the Negro problem, to belittle aspiration, to nullify such leadership and seek and crush these people back into the mass out of which by toil and travail they and their fathers have raised themselves," end of quote. For Mário Pinto de Andrade, this devaluation was instrumental for the emergence of nationalism in Portuguese Africa. In broad strokes, this was the world that had formed and informed Cabral and some of his close friends by the time they arrived in Portugal to pursue their higher education in 1945. Legally, they were considered Portuguese, particularly in the context of the promulgation of the Portuguese Constitution of 1933, in which there was no formal separation whatsoever between those born in metropolitan Portugal and those born in the colonies. But they were now in a position of having to prove that they were not indigenous natives. Contrary to what Du Bois had observed among an earlier generation of students on his trip to Portugal in 1923, the group of students of which Cabral was part did not arrive in Lisbon with the financial support of their families, but thanks to religious denomination, philanthropy, and the colonial state. Even though they were considered for the most part cidadãos de segunda, second-class citizens, these young people were still thinking about what being Portuguese would allow them to do. Cabral was deeply interested and invested in questions of land in Cape Verde, writing a series of pieces on the subject for the recent created Voz do Povo, edited in Praia, Cape Verde. However, when time came to choose the topic for his dissertation, he chose to study Portuguese agriculture, and more particularly the struggle of the Portuguese white peasant for his final dissertation. After receiving his degree in agronomy, he worked for a few years in Angola, where he came to know the plight of the indigenous. But there is nothing in his life for writing that anticipated his move to Guinea-Bissau to organize the anti-colonial struggle. I have written my biography of Cabral that all the identity confusion Cabral seems to have experienced up to the late 1950s may have stemmed from the notion that the concept of nation state was not available to him at that time in history. Only after Ghana and Guinea-Conakry gained independence in 1947 was Cabral's generation able to turn dissatisfaction with colonial rule into clandestine organization to end the colonial order. The war for independence in Lusophone Africa started in Angola in 1961, when guerrillas from the Frente Nacional de Libertação de Angola, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, attacked settlers' farms in the north of the country and killed Portuguese settlers and Angola indigenous indiscriminately. This revolt, which figures prominently in Frantz Fanon's Wretch of the Earth, even though it's not directly referred to, is fundamental to understand both Cabral proposed the linking from the empire, but also would like to suggest the crystallization of the condition of the diasporic Black community in what remained of the Portuguese Empire. I will come to this point later. In the 1960s, the Portuguese were convinced that they could survive Africa's nationalist moment uncathed by the application of domestic fixes to their presence in Africa. They improved the condition of native farmers and sent troops to Portuguese Africa to subdue the resistance, to such an extent, in fact, that Angola became the most fractious issue of Kennedy's presidency in the US, for it brought to the fore the contradiction of an administration that was attempting to support civil rights at home and self-determination abroad. But more importantly, Portugal abolished the indigenato, turning every person born in the empire into a Portuguese citizen. This is a sort of reconstruction of the Portuguese presence in Africa. One can reconceptualize with the help of Du Bois. Like any book of its breadth and profundity, Du Bois' Black Reconstruction lends itself to various readings and has been read and appropriated in different ways. For Du Bois himself, the book was about writing history against the grain of the dominant framework in the historical literature of American Reconstruction, particularly the Dunning School, which disregarded the critical and enormous contribution of African Americans in the formation of modern American democracy. For Du Bois, African Americans saved the Union. For one of the most careful readers of Du Bois, Charles Lemmer. Black reconstruction can be interpreted as a sort of deconstruction, a la Jacques Derrida, rather than mere reconstruction. Throughout the book, Du Bois not only envisions an epistemological reversal in the ways in which the topic was being discussed in mid-1935, but also forcefully makes the case for or illuminates the absence in the description of the history under analysis, which had they been taken into consideration would allow for a better, if not different, understanding of America's reconstruction. In my own reading, Black Reconstruction in America is not only about the ways in which African Americans have taken the craft of their future and aspiration in their own hands. It's also about how democracy worked back then and continues to work through arbitration of access. Putting it slightly different, Black Reconstruction allows for a less theological reading, but one that comes to terms with the ways in which full political participation is curtailed for certain groups of people on the basis of gender, class, or race. Such an insight is important to understand democracy in most of the world, and particularly in what remained of the Portuguese Empire. As Du Bois abundantly demonstrates, the universalization of citizenship rights in the United States in the wake of the Civil War and the promulgation of the 14th Amendment was followed by reconfiguration of the political system aimed at the disenfranchisement of sectors of the population. It was not much different in the Portuguese case. With the creation of the fascist Estado Novo, under the leadership of António de Oliveira Salazar in 1933, Portuguese colonies in Africa were integrated into the definition of Portugal itself. This provides the background for understanding implementation of the indigenato as a way by which labor could be captured so that Portugal could assert its autonomy in relation to the rest of the world. Orgulhosamente sós, proudly alone, as Salazar famously put it. The granting of Portuguese citizenship to African-born people in the Portuguese Empire could only take place through the reconstruction of the empire itself and the redistribution of privilege. I will give one single example. With the proclamation of Estado Novo, the Estado Novo constitutional law was very clear on the separation between the state and the government, and correspondingly, the head of the state and the head of the government. Since the Estado Novo came out of the military coup in 1926, the consensus was that the head of state, the president of the republic, would always be someone from the military with the rank of general. But this would only be a ceremonial position. Executive power per se would rest in the hands of the head of the government, the president of the council, a position occupied by António de Oliveira Salazar for much of the fascist regime in Portugal. One of the few prerogatives bestowed on the president of the republic was the ability to dissolve the government. So, in the increasingly dwindling arena of anti-fascist resistance in Portugal, there were those who believed that replacing the country's leadership through general election could lead to a quiet revolution and regime change. In 1948, a time in which, as in the United States, the struggle for racial equality was a prerogative of the Communist Party, anti-fascist resistance in Portugal coalesced around the presidential candidate Norton de Matos, a former governor of Angola. This attempt to challenge Salazar was called the Movimento de União Democrática, Movement for Democratic Union. And Cabral was a part of it through his membership at the Casa dos Estudantes do Império, a house of the students of the empire. Over the next years, there was then a real possibility that the opposition would dethrone the Estado Novo, especially given the nationalization of those born in Africa. Consequently, the constitution was revised. From 1958 up to the end of Estado Novo, the president of the republic was to be elected in the National Assembly, which was controlled by Salazar's party. The amendment was convenient because it allowed the citizenship basis to be expanded without affecting the electoral process. Portugal's expansion of citizenship and simultaneous funneling of the electoral process are instances of those disavowals and disenfranchisements Du Bois was attempt at coming to in terms of coming to terms with in Black Reconstruction, which I have been using to shed light onto the world that Cabral came into and vowed to change. As my final point, to show how these questions are still relevant in what remains of the Portuguese Empire, let me move to contemporary Portugal and its race relations. In September 2022, last year, the Portuguese newspaper, Diário de Notícias, published a story on a petition organized by a group of African veterans who had been recruited to fight Cabral's insurgency from 1964 to 1973. These men accused Portugal of being ungrateful, quote, for the service they had given and the blood they spilled in defense of the empire, end of quote. The petitioners, represented by Amadou Jao, president of the Association of Veterans of the Armed Forces of Guinea, contended that they had been abandoned and left to die by Portugal when Guinea became independent, in contravention of the Agreement of Argel from 1974, according to which Portugal was responsible for their security and their rights. However, with new constitutional law that came out of the Carnation Revolution in 1974, the meaning of what it meant to be Portuguese had changed. By cutting ties with the empire, Portugal also cut ties with those who, since 1961, had been considered Portuguese. The petition reads, quote, we veterans of the armed forces of Portugal saw comrades, friends, fathers, brothers giving their lives for Portugal. We were born and we were raised Portuguese. We were since 1961 full citizens of Portugal. In the hour of all decisions when Portugal needed us, we were available. We are what is left of these more than 20,000 sons of Guinea that did not refuse what was ours, an irrefusable citizenship duty. Because we were born Portuguese, we served Portugal when Portugal asked us to serve. To do so was the highest honor, end of quote. It continues. Quote, never before has a state stripped away a vast proportion of his citizens from the right to citizenship by evoking a strictly racial criteria or a strictly racist criteria. Out of the 20 million Portuguese they were in 1975, 60 were sadly, involuntarily, and illegally because of being in clear contravention of the international law, the United Nations Charter, and the Constitution dispensation prior to 1976, declare non-Portuguese. I cannot give these except the importance they deserve in the time I have left to finish this presentation, but I will beg for your indulgence in allowing me to make two concluding remarks. For many years, Portugal and a few other European nations have been quite generous at restituting citizenship rights or on religious grounds to descendants of those who had been stripped of it. The reasons for these are too complex that they deserve an essay in their own. Of importance here is that the criteria behind such restitutions are based on blood rather than birthright, to the extent that in a few cases, it has become easier to claim citizenship based on descent from the Sephardic Jews whose communities were forced to leave Portugal more than 400 years ago, than on the grounds of being born in Portugal to foreign parents, let alone being born in the extinct Portuguese Empire to descendants of the enslaved. And yet, Portugal harbors the largest diasporic communities from the empire, certainly from Angolan and Guinean, if not Cape Verde. However, African presence in Portugal does not necessarily translate into visibility. An explanation for this in the reading of Black Reconstruction, and I often hear, is that democracy is not always about inclusion. This does not mean that the meaning of democracy resides in the opposite direction, but rather that democracy becomes the ways in which wealth and privilege are distributed. So this brings me to my second concluding remark on the extent to which Du Bois might have misread Portuguese society in the 20s in his description of its colorblindness. This question can provisionally be met with two answers. The first one points to the propagandist nature of Du Bois' work, an aspect abundantly demonstrated by his most trusted and authoritative biographer, David Lewis. Likewise, Charles Lamet has warned us that in Du Bois, quote, the theory usually served is politics, end of quote. Since Du Bois was an active agent for social transformation in the United States, he shows for the most part a penchant for showing the extent to which the US was farther behind in terms of the advancement of Black folks than almost every other country he visited or could speak of. But I also think that there is something else at play by positing Du Bois' interventions in their proper historical context, and particularly within the context of global history. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction was written in a particular global conjuncture marked by, in the US and the world, the Great Depression and the ascent of fascism, particularly in Europe. Charles Lamet also makes the case for the similarity in terms of the zeitgeist between the period in which the book was written, the Great Depression, and the period the book addresses, the Reconstruction. But for me, reading and writing Black Reconstruction as an African, and from the point of view of one who has written on the life and struggles of Cabral, something else is worth noting. One cannot fail to contrast the pessimism of Black Reconstruction with the optimism Du Bois seems to exude in his previous work, such as Word of Color. In the 1920s, Du Bois was perhaps espousing a more Marxist view of historical materialism, in that he could see and document the progress of men and women of color towards equality. In the 1930s, years of not only economic but also moral depression, the possibility of equality was foreclosed, and the violence later espoused by Fanon and Cabral seemed to be the only way out of the abyss. Even though, for the most part, and contrary to Marx, Du Bois made a clear distinction between Black and white workers. Sorry, even though, for the most part, and Du Bois made a clear distinction between Black and white workers, and central in further discussions of the possibility of Black Marxism, he was still a strong believer in how industrial democracy or the dictatorship of labor could contribute to the emergence of a form of politics that would not only displace prevailing structures that arbitrate through the distribution of wealth and privileges, but also bring about a coalition between white and black labor. Cabral might have subscribed to this view early when he worked as an agronomist for the colonial state and believed that the most pressing problem of the empire was fascism, and that the alignment of black and white labor for the destruction of such a political dispensation was still viable. These, of course, some of these in Du Bois, there is some of these in Du Bois' thesis on the general strike. However, with the implementation of Indigenato, the native law, such a redemptive possibility for society transformation was no longer available, because the Indigenato brought something else to modern politics, which Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben have attempted to illuminate in their writings. It brought unqualified labor into the center of politics by denying such workers the kind of consciousness they couldn't attain through his or her own work. To put it differently, the Indigenato denied the work of conscientization to the extent that all that was left for the indigena was revolutionary violence. One question to ask in the effort to understand the different propositions of Du Bois and Cabral is whether present-day democracy is made of contemporary forms of, is more made of contemporary forms of indigenato rather than labor, in the ways Du Bois discussed the concept of the dictatorship of labor. And I would stop here. Thank you so much.
Professor Tomás, thank you so much for that incredible talk. And before I turn it over to Professor Osuna, I would like to remind everyone that the way that we will be doing the question and answer period is to just put your questions in the chat, and I will take them one by one and field them to our panelists. And so turning it over to you, Professor Osuna, for your discussant comments. Thank you so much.
All right, what's up, y'all? Greetings, saludos to everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Black Reconstruction as a Portal project for inviting me to participate in this event. Really appreciate the collaboration between us. Thank you, Antonio, for sharing your work, and Chris for facilitating. So when thinking of Black Reconstruction as a portal, I think of the first time I read the text. My first reading of Black Reconstruction was not in the sociology department, fortunately. Although a sociologist, Du Bois is not, in some way, some may say still isn't prioritized in the field. My first reading of this text was in a Black Studies graduate seminar with Cedric Robinson titled Black Radical Thought. In this seminar, we did a close reading of Black Reconstruction, Black Jacobins, and Black Marxism. Reading these texts in conversation with each other was crucial for my own political and ideological, not to mention intellectual development. These texts in conversation provide a theoretical and methodological training in Marxism and Black radicalism. They remind us that when we write about working class struggles against colonialism, imperialism, and global capitalism, that the analysis we develop is always derivative to the struggles of the masses. In Antonio's talk today, W.E.B. Du Bois and Amílcar Cabral are centered, but as he shows us, their writings and actions were informed by the historical conjunctures and the masses they accompanied in making history. In Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson notes, and I quote, "In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois had striven to enrich the critique of capitalism and bourgeois society that emerged into the dominant strains of Western radicalism. He had no choice if he wanted to comprehend the crisis of war and depression that devastated the world system in his lifetime, and the rebellion and the revolution in Asia, Europe, Africa, and the New World that were their concomitants," unquote. This critique of capitalism and bourgeois society is also illustrated succinctly in Du Bois's 1915 essay, The African Roots of War, which I will return to shortly. Du Bois was an intellectual, but also an active agent in the struggle against US imperialism and racial capitalism. Similarly, Amílcar Cabral enriched not only a critique of capitalist imperialism and colonialism, he sought to overthrow it through armed struggle and national liberation. In his 1966 speech at the First Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in Havana, Cuba, Cabral argued that, quote, there can be no national liberation without the use of liberating violence on the part of nationalist forces in answer to criminal violence of the agents of imperialism, unquote. He noted that imperialism was piracy transplanted from sea to dry land, piracy reorganized, consolidated, and adapted to the aim of plundering the natural and human resources of his people. In this violent struggle for national liberation from the clutches of Portuguese colonialism, Cabral and the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cabo Verde were producing revolutionary theory. In Antonio's talk today, we are invited to think about Du Bois and Cabral, not in an exercise of compare and contrast, but rather how the work of Du Bois in his writing and action provide the context in which figures like Cabral emerged and sought revolutionary solutions to their social conditions. A trenchant struggle that both Du Bois and Cabral engaged in was a struggle against bourgeois democracy and the racism that enshrines it. Tomás described this as negative democracy. To conceptualize negative democracy, he suggests that we engage in an analysis of empire. In Abolition Democracy, Angela Davis reiterates this point addressed by Tomás, but instead of empire, Davis argues for us to think through imperialism, so we retain the specific connections to capitalism. In thinking of negative democracy and imperialism, I'm reminded of Du Bois' essay, The African Roots of War. In this essay, Du Bois theorizes imperialism and its destruction in Africa and offers the conceptualization of democratic despotism to discuss what Vladimir Lenin referred to as the aristocracy of labor in Western countries. As Antonio notes, negative democracy, like Du Bois' democratic despotism, becomes the way in which wealth and privilege are distributed. So is there a link between Antonio's discussion of democratic democracy and Du Bois' democratic despotism? Does one build on the other, or are they different articulations of a broader bourgeois democracy? Antonio also introduces us to the Portugal native law, what he calls indigenato. In this law or social process, created a category of human beings, the native, that would be susceptible to super exploitation. According to Therese Burton-Stelly, super exploitation refers to, quote, an economic relationship in which the intensity, form, and racial basis of exploitation differs little from slavery, unquote. Antonio's description of indigenados shows us how race was used as a rationalization for super exploitation and enclosures by way of segregation. Indigenato denied conscientization to the indigena, which Tomás notes left them with revolution as the only solution. However, is conscientización not necessary step toward revolution? Didn't Cabral and his generation go through a process of conscientización that led them to lead a nationalist armed struggle? At the end of his talk, Antonio asks if present-day democracy is made of contemporary forms of indigenato rather than labor. For me, this question brings into stark relief the racialization of surplus populations and working class precariousness under neoliberal capitalism. An important reflection from listening to Antonio's talk is the analysis of class interests in regards to the petty bourgeoisie. This was an issue that both Du Bois and Cabral engaged in their analysis and fight against capitalist imperialism. In Black Reconstruction, for example, Du Bois notes the stark class interest of the Black masses and the smaller Black petty bourgeoisie by describing how a sector of the Black bourgeoisie were like the whites who were seeking to climb to wealth rather than building a position of power for the laboring class. Similarly, Cabral, in his formulation of class suicide, recognized that class aspirations were seductive and a barrier to social revolution. Antonio notes that the clash between Cabral's nationalist generation, with aspirations of delinking from imperialism, and his father's proto-nationalist generation, who sought reforms within it. This continues to haunt our current struggles. It speaks to the late Glenn Ford of the Black Agenda Report and his analysis of the Black misleadership class. In returning to Black Reconstruction as a portal, with Cabral and his revolutionary theory in mind, I believe the portal is a conduit to what philosopher J. Mafawad Paul calls a new return to what millions of masses around the world have struggled and died for, and that is a struggle for socialism. Du Bois eloquently describes this new return in Black Reconstruction when discussing the counter-revolution of property and the worldwide depression it created. When it comes to building a new society from the rubbles of the old one, Du Bois argues, and I quote, "And the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867, 1876. Land, light, leading for slaves, Black, brown, yellow, and white under dictatorship of the proletariat," unquote. As longtime Chicago organizer and Marxist-Leninist Frank Chapman argues, quote, "The number one challenge facing the Black liberation movement today is to finish the democratic revolution that started in 1861 by removing white supremacist institutions that stand with a flaming sword in the road to genuine people's democracy, to multiracial, multinational working class unity, and to a socialist revolution that frees the human race from the scourges of imperialism," unquote. This is the portal that Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and Amílcar Cabral's revolutionary theory invites us to enter. Thank you, Antonio, for reminding us of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. I just want to see if, Antonio, you would like to just spend a couple of minutes responding to Stephen's comments, and then we'll move straight into the Q&A.
Stephen, thank you so much for your generous reading of my piece and your comments. I was not as lucky as you to be introduced to these magnificent piece of reflection and writing, Black Reconstruction, in university when I was doing my PhD at Columbia. I think who introduced me to this piece was Yusuf al-Burushi, who invited me to write this piece, And I really think it speaks to the ways in which we not just to the ways in which we are trained, but to the ways in which we approach these questions of Blackness, these questions of revolution, and so on, and the tools we have to do theory. And I think you mentioned so many concepts that are so central, and I think yeah, and I think you are right. Often these reflections on notions such as separate class and precariousness and so on. And I think this is and you have written about that, and even what you've written about the suicide of the bourgeoisie. It really speaks to the notion of the conscientization and how this concept is important to sort of create, a sort of consciousness in relation to these societal problems. But yeah, just a way to say thank you so much for your reading, and yeah, I will come back to these comments.
Yeah, and I just want to respond that, I was building off of this too, also off of your biography, right? I was reading the biography of Cabral and the stuff you share about his life and the struggles he was going through and his connection to the people, but also not necessarily always present with the people, right? So it's like there is that struggle of him not always there because he was traveling, right? And only reading about what was going on the ground through memos or statements, right? And that just was really important for me to reflect on just the struggles of building a movement, right? Building national, in his context, national liberation. In our context, just building movements to struggle against our exploitation in this country, right? And how the importance of being tied to on the ground, right? And I think that's something that, I read in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. I read that in a lot of the writings of Amílcar Cabral, right? And as I mentioned, certain current struggles and current ideas of, like, for example, I mentioned Glenn Ford and his idea of the Black misleadership class, right? The idea of this political class of Black elites, and I would even say brown elites in the Latin community that have no relationship to the communities and the struggles of the people, right? And oftentimes are in contradiction to the struggles of the people, right? And so in reading your texts and listening to this and thinking about like the idea of indigenato and the struggles of the people and the misreading that Du Bois had, right? That when he went to Portugal and he met those folks, like, oh, this is great. It's like, we're actually not talking to the people on the ground, dude. You're talking to the elite, you know, like that's a misstep on your part, right? And I think that was an important reflection, right? So just think about those things. And again, like towards the end, when I finished my comments about thinking about Frank Chapman, which has a really good book on the Marxist-Leninism and liberation, and Black life liberation in the United States. You know, he's tying the same thing, talking about the looking at Black Reconstruction as a failed democratic revolution, right? And the importance of going back to that moment. So it's just like Du Bois looking at that moment and having us think of it as one of the most revolutionary periods in this country. And I think me having the opportunity to read it with someone that was also thinking in those terms and not thinking as just a sociologist, right? And I'm a sociologist, so you know, don't hold that against me. But it's like, you know, thinking more critically and more radically about these ideas that Du Bois was thinking about is very important and useful for us in this current moment.
Thanks to both of you. I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. And the first one is from Samasa Boca. And it reads, brilliant presentation, Dr. Tomás. I wanted to hear you talk about Du Bois and Cabral's philosophy of history. I'm sure that their philosophies evolved throughout their lives, so perhaps we can focus on Black Reconstruction and Cabral's The Weapon of Theory speech. How do they understand the construction of history and its use for contemporary struggle?
Oh, that's a tough question. You know, I think Cabral, I think one of, and this is not part of this piece, you know, but I think Du Bois was one of the first Black, but perhaps one of the first scholars to really think about methodologically and epistemologically about the history of Africa, right? And I think the great challenge for Cabral, because he has written on African history, and I think the question he asked in the book that he has written on African history or history of Africa was how to write about the history of Africa in the context in which, you know, the history of Africa had been rendered to us, you know. Because anyone who has written about Africa prior to 1950 would always start with, you know, the fact that Africa doesn't have written records and so on. And for Cabral, for Du Bois, that was the challenge, right? How to write about. Now today we have more resources to write, because we can use archaeology, we can use oral history and so on. But when Du Bois came to these questions and tried to reflect on the history of Africa, that was the main question that he asked. And I think Cabral has naturally, I think, read Du Bois. And if not in The Weapon of Theory, perhaps in the Nation and Culture, the piece he writes about culture. I think he writes a very similar question, or at least he echoes a very similar problem, because for Cabral, and he has written about that, for Cabral, the point of revolution, African revolution, was to bring African people to history. He mentioned many times that colonialism create a sort of, colonialism was this process that separate Africans from their own history, you know, because colonialism, particularly Portuguese colonialism, which I think is a very particular kind of colonialism in the ways in which they imposed assimilation, right? So for Cabral, which was part of these groups, the so-called assimilados, assimilated national revolution or nationalism was a way actually to bring Africans to their own history, to appropriate their own history. So I think there is a lot of similarities, and of course, a lot of a lot of thinking to be done in terms of bringing together these two concepts of history in Cabral and Du Bois.
Great, thank you so much. We've got a few more in the queue, and this one is from Yusuf Albalushi, who started us off this morning. And he says, I would like to ask you, Antonio, to once again summarize your fascinating main arguments regarding the crucial difference between Portuguese colonialism that arbitrated inclusion along primarily the lines of labor and race, and the model of indirect rule as analyzed by Mamdani that arbitrated inclusion primarily along ethnic lines. Can you please once again explain the crucial role played by the indigenado in shaping the trajectory of the anti-colonial struggle? And, okay, there's more. And can you also please tie this to the question of the arbitration of democracy as your parallel reading between Reconstruction in the US and Reconstruction of the Portuguese Empire? And finally, and relatedly, are you arguing, as you seem to hint at in your biography, that national liberation as the pursuit of sovereignty was a misstep in the anti-colonial struggle, whereas the continued pursuit of a more radical form of inclusion through federation would have been a better option for the struggle, as Gary Wilder has argued via Césaire and Senghor? Not too difficult to handle there.
These questions are not difficult. Whew, how I'm gonna start to respond there. I think and I think the main difference has to be, to give a very short answer, the main difference between the Portuguese direct rule and Portuguese direct rule and the British indirect rule, which we are talking about, on one hand, the creation of native administration, and on the other hand, the indigenato. I think the main difference is that British indirect rule was a form of was a form of politicizing culture, right? So you create native authorities, and you create local polities, right? Some of them were enforced, some of them existed before the arrival of colonialism and so on. But these structures, these native authorities have political autonomy, and they do so through the politicization of culture. Mamdani says that this is what happened to Portugal, happened to the French when they abandoned assimilation, the category that they called évoluer, and they, start to import, the thinking of the British colonialism into French colonial system, and they were start to transition to indirect rule. And Mamdani makes the same arguments to Portugal, in Angola and Mozambique and so on. But the Portuguese, they gesture towards that, but they haven't done, or they haven't tried to do anything like that, because the Portuguese, they, for many reasons, because they didn't formalize the legal, the legal system of different groups and tribes and so on, to the extent that during colonialism, the differences between between different ethnic groups are not as clear as in South Africa, as in Nigeria, as in Ghana, right? Because the Portuguese didn't have resources, didn't have the passions to do this work. But particularly because the Portuguese have found this magic idea, which was the idea of the indigenato, you know? So the indigenato was actually, instead of dividing the whole population of the dominated into different categories, different groups, different ethnic groups. For the Portuguese, the main way to organize, to deal, to control, to manage populations in Africa was to create this big group, the indigenato. The indigenato was simply a category to divide the civilized from those who were not civilized, the natives, right? And it was for this reason, a category of those who could be conscripted to labor, you know, because one thing that the Portuguese had to struggle more than any other colonial power was by the end of slavery, right? Portugal was actually, you know, the country, I can't say that, was the country in Europe that profited the most with slavery. Sometimes not for, you know, Portugal or Portuguese, you know, gain of the Portuguese, was not for the gain of the Portuguese bourgeoisie, was simply that the Portuguese were involved deeply in the abduction and trade of Africans to America, to the US, to Cuba, to Brazil, to, you know, all over Jamaica, all over North and South America. So when the slavery ends, the great question that Portuguese had to solve, and they had to colonize, you know, because they were claiming these huge territories in Africa. So the great question was how to do that, you know, how to extract wealth from these places, particularly Angola and Mozambique. And the idea was the creation of indigenato, which is very interesting to note that the indigenato starts to emerge around the same time that the British were, you know, talking about indirect rule. So I think this is a huge difference between two systems. On one hand, a system based on culture, the politicization of culture, indirect rule. On the other hand, a system based on the amalgamation of the population so that labor could be more efficiently extracted. So the second question, the arbitration of democracy, can you just say 2 words about the second? Arbitration of democracy.
Do you want me to repeat the last part for you?
Yeah, just the second question.
Okay. And finally.
No, this is, okay.
Oh, wait, and can you please tie this to the question of the arbitration of democracy as your parallel reading between Reconstruction in the US and Reconstruction of the Portuguese Empire? Okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to do is like, I really, you know, I'm an anthropologist. I think I'm engaged, concerned with present conditions. But I really think that, you know, we cannot, the present conditions are formed by, you know, all these structures that we inherit from the past. I really think that the question of racism in Portugal today, in contemporary Portugal, and it's a huge question, you know. I read every day, you know, you have a lot of people doing work, a lot of organizations, associations, you know, and there is the question of visibility. There is the question of visibility, you know, that you don't have Black people in many aspects of Portuguese society. in the university. I know only one Black woman that teaches, that has a permanent job in the whole Portuguese system. They are more, but I only know one. And TV, you know, the media, you don't have representation, you don't have visibility. I really think that this is, and I think this is perhaps some work that I still have to do, but I really think that this is, I really think that this comes from the past. This comes from the ways in which indigenato was depoliticized because it was a labor condition. And as Stephen was saying, you know, I think you can make the parallel between invisibility and precariousness or the super class. These forms of social precariousness that, you know, Black folks in Portugal still have, and in many parts of the world have to do, as you can make the parallel between the disenfranchisation of Black Americans today, you know, and as Stephen was saying, the failed revolution that Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction, you know. So I think there is still work to do in terms of making these connections more clear. But I think it's a worthwhile intellectual exercise to engage with. And I think in terms of national liberation and federation, yeah, you know, Gary Wilder, you know, he's always back of my mind when I talk about this. And I think that was, and I think this is, you know, when Cabral, and I mentioned in this piece, and I think it's a bit, you know, I read about this in the book as well, you know, and I think it's not for the fault of, it's not because of it's not a problem of the Cabral's generation, is that when they start the anti-colonial war, the notion of the nation state was not there, you know, so they could not be nationalists in the proper sense of the word. And I think it's also interesting to compare, and this is what I was saying in my piece, the generation that preceded Cabral's generation, and how they are pretty much inside the empire, think with the empire, thinking how to change, how to inform the empire, you know. And of course, there is Portugal, there is also an attempt. And to be honest, you know, the shift of Portugal to a federation starts around, or perhaps even before the time that Gary Wilder talks about, you know, when the Portuguese constitution abolishes the notion or expands the notion of citizenship to the extent that everyone born in the Portuguese Empire was considered to be Portuguese. And the last point I wanna make, António Spínola, if you read my book, was not the governor of Guinea-Bissau during the time that Cabral was waging anti-colonial war. And then he became the first president of Portugal after revolution. And he tried to resurrect the concept of the federation. And he even went to Guinea to, you know, as de Gaulle did before when he went to Africa, to explain and to get support for the idea of creation of a federation between Portugal and the colonies. So this idea was always there, and you can find, you know, many ways in which the Portuguese try to come to this idea. But I really believe by the time by the time Senghor, Césaire, even by the time Spínola and all the Portuguese that tried to do this, tried to impose this idea or try to come to terms with how to put this into practice was late. And I think it was late because of the concept of self-determination. and how the concept of self-determination exploded after 45, the Second World War, and became the only way to organize society.
Thank you for that. A great response to a complex question. And I have two questions here, one pertaining to race in Angola and one pertaining to race in Portugal. I will read the one pertaining to Angola first. And this is from Asif Augusto. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Prof. António Tomás. Don't you think similar dynamics of race and class are still at play today in Angola, in particular in places like Luanda, where the distinctions real Angolans, outsiders, are still based on factors like speaking Portuguese well or having Portuguese names? I'm thinking about how the Angolan elites pretty much use colonial definitions to define who belongs, who doesn't belong, based on ability to speak Portuguese or have a Portuguese name. The fact that in Angola, there's no teaching, there's not any teaching of any vernacular language at school is the indication that the legacy of colonialism is still at play, plays a role in Angolan society.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's yeah, I think it's such an important question, because if we, it looks like race and racism are not topics worth pursuing in Angola, because Angola is an independent country. Angola has a white population of 1 or 2%, So one may think that it's not worth writing, thinking, investigating about race in Angola because of that, because different, contrary to the US or contrary to Portugal, you don't have two opposing groups, right? But I think that race is fundamental to understand race. Race is fundamental to understand Angolan contemporary formations, Angolan politics, Angolan society, and so on. And the examples given, the examples that you give, it are very, very central, And I think it comes back to the question of the indigenato, the colonial distinction between indigenato, those who don't belong, those who don't have like what they call the qualities to be called civilized, And I think there was a test, and they had like 4 or 5 things that people would have to pass in order to be considered civilized. They had to speak Portuguese. They have to show that they were able to use utensils, eating. They have to, they have to show all these kinds of things. And there was like an inspector, a clerk that would go to the house of these people and to test. And the difference between being an indigenous and being a civilized were large, right? It was how, people had a sense of themselves, which society they belong, how much they could aspire, where they could live, where they could send kids to school, how much they could earn in terms of salary, and so on, So I think what happened is that these distinctions are still there in Angola, in Angola, or perhaps in lesser degree in Mozambique, but these distinctions are still there. And how politics in Angola works is still based, the whole civil war and, ethnic nationalism around, movements in the north, with Fenelá movements in the south, with groups that are outside of Luanda, and they want to have their own cultures. They want to teach their language to their own children and so on. But they also know that doing this would affect you know, the kind of aspirations that children could have. So I think this is a very important question, and this is actually what I meant when I was saying that, you know, engaging with these historical formations are very important to understand the present day we inhabit.
Thank you for that. And I want to read a couple of coming from Portugal. One is, first of all, congrats for the amazing work. I just want to say that I live in Portugal, and it's true. It's very difficult to see that years have passed and we are still fighting for representation in so many ways. We are still trying to find a way to help the future generation. That's from Carla Mellon. And I just want to combine that with another comment and question. Thank you. This is from Catarina Casanova. Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I teach at the University of Lisbon, and day by day, I see people whitewashing fascism in Portugal, the longest dictatorship in Europe, whitewashing the Código de Indignato and those responsible for them, saying that Portuguese colonization was so much lighter for native people than the Spanish one. Portugal is a racist country, and there is no democracy in a racist state. There is a bourgeois democracy. You mentioned in the final part of your presentation the concept of revolutionary violence. Should we not also use the concept of colonial violence?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, I think it's very problematic how these categories came into being, you know, and how the system that was created was a system that made people like my own family, you know. I don't want to, I'm always very reticent to bring my own biography to these discussions, you know, but my name is António Tomás, but this is not, you know, it's a name that my family had to change the name 3 generations ago, you know, because changing your name, being able to speak Portuguese, being able to show that you have the manners and the predisposition of a Portuguese person would allow you to have access to the civilized society, and which would come with all the privileges, you know. So I really think that I don't want to compare colonialisms and say that the British or the French were better forms of colonialism than the Portuguese. But I really think that there is like there is an aspect, a more destructive aspect of colonialism that one does not see, you know, in the place of South Africa, in the place like South Africa, you know. And South Africa is not like, you know, domination. Colonialism in South Africa was also very violent, you know, but at least, I don't know, people have internal cultural resources to fashion their own being in the world, you know. Whereas I think people from Angola who are descendants from assimilado have less space to create or to fashion the African identity, you know. And of course, we can think and we can say that, you know, what is there? Assimilado is a culture that then as any other culture in Africa, you know. But I really think that there is an aspect, very destructive aspect of Portuguese colonialism that we have to engage with and we have to account. And yeah, of course, yeah, I think in terms of the second question, I think, yeah, colonial violence and revolutionary violence. Yeah, I don't think that they are, you know, different terms because they speak to the same problem, you know. Anywhere in the world, when the dominated people, when the enslaved when the indigenous, race against exploitation, you have a revolution. But of course, in this case, in the context of colonialism.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two related questions, and maybe even Stephen might want to jump in here, just welcoming you to do that if you wish. The first is from Isabel Rodriguez. Thank you for this brilliant lecture. Could you say more about Du Bois's visit to Lisbon and his thoughts on Portuguese colonialism? And then the second one, relatedly, is from Mamadou Ba. I want to thank you for the brilliant presentation. If possible, I would like to hear you talk about two things. What explains the very marginal place that Du Bois occupies in the Lusophone academic debate, namely about his importance for anti-colonialism and Pan-Africanism? Two, what influence may Lusotropicalism have had on this, particularly on the profound denial of contemporary structural racism?
Okay. Okay, the question of Mamadou, yeah, thank you for being here. Mamadou is a very important activist for racial equality in Lisbon, so it's great to have, and this is the conversation that we have had and we are having, but I think that, and I think this is, I would like to say that, and I said this many times to Yusuf. I think this is really what is important about this event, the portal, to bring Du Bois to this debate, because I don't think that Portugal or Portuguese Africa is the only place in the world where people are not engaging with Du Bois. I really think that this is how, the whole, we can have, it's another conversation, but that's to say this very briefly. I really think that this is how, contemporary discussions of race, diaspora takes place. I really think that we are too focused on our own realities. If you American, you talk about America. If you're Portuguese, you talk about Portuguese. If you're Black French, you talk about France, and so on, So I think that even one thing that Du Bois proposed, and I think this is what I attempt to do, particularly my response to the first question, the question of history. One thing that Du Bois was proposing, and he has written, he traveled, he went to Africa, he died in Africa, in Ghana, and so on. So one thing that he was proposing was to bring together, the experience, the Black experience, to think of Black experience, and not the ways in which we sort of compartmentalize different kinds of Black experiences, the diasporic, the African-American, the African, and so on, But I really think that bringing Africa to these debates of diasporic Blackness, I really think it's a very important thing to do. And perhaps in Portugal, because of the time that these African former Portuguese colonies became independent, you still have a lot of people going back and forth. These conversations are still very present, but these debates are less present in the US. If you see a lot of African-American Black scholars are writing about Black experience, in which you don't see a lot of engagement with African, African and African experience. So I think it's very important, these initiatives, to bring this conversation together. But I think you're right. I think there is something about racism today in Portugal that comes from the ways in which Lusotropicalism was articulated. Lusotropicalism was the idea, that the Estado Novo imported from Brazilian, from the study of this Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Frei, about the plastic nature, that the Portuguese had particular predisposition to mix with people from other cultures, and this produced a sort of a different kind of society, a non-racialist society, and so on. So by the time the war started, the Portuguese could make the argument that they were not racist because they were creating multiracial society. So there was no racism in Portugal or in Portuguese colonies and so on. I think this problem is still there, today. And I think this is particularly the difficulty that in Portugal people have to talk about racism. It's because of the baggage. It's because of the legacy of Lusotropicalism, and the idea that the Portuguese were a different kind of colonizers. They were not like the Bois, or they were not like the British or even the French, because they have this predisposition to mix with Africans in a way that only they could do, right? And if they have done that, as the argument goes, so what is racism? How to engage with racism, So I think it's Lusotropicalism and how it's so ingrained in Portuguese colonial ideology and Portuguese colonial mentality is still very important to understand contemporary forms of racism in Portugal. Sorry, the first question by Isabel Rodriguez. Sorry, I am.
Yeah, the question was, if you could just expand a little bit more on Du Bois's visit to Lisbon and his thoughts on Portuguese colonialism. Yeah.
Okay. I don't have much about Du Bois' visit to Lisbon. I know that that it was in the context of the Third Pan-African Congress. The Third Pan-African Congress took place in 3 European cities, and it was not even supposed, because I think the first one was Brussels, and I think it was not even part of the Congress. He traveled to Lisbon and he traveled to Lisbon and he included this travel as a section of the Third Pan-African Congress. He has written a few pieces about that in Crisis, which I didn't revisit this time because I don't have access to this wonderful archive. But it was a very problematic event because of how the Portuguese try to control the event, and how the Portuguese administration found that a meeting with only Black people could be subversive, to the extent that, because Du Bois could not speak Portuguese, and most of the Black activists he was in contact with could not speak English. So what happened is that the translator was the Minister of Colonies himself, just to show how problematic these.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that idea of Du Bois and why hasn't marginal. And I even think here in the United States, right? So as you're saying, Antonio, it's like, I think, as I mentioned in the start of my comments, right, about being marginal even in sociology, right? That he's oftentimes just like pigeonholed, and it's like, oh, let's just talk about Du Bois for this one day and that's it, right? It's like not seen as someone that's central to our understanding of U.S. history, but not only just U.S. history, just international history in general, right? because he had so much to say. He was an internationalist, right? He was traveling, as you mentioned, he was traveling everywhere, right? There's these great pictures of him and Mao, right, visiting China, right? And so I think there's a lot to learn from Du Bois, and unfortunately, people don't read Black Reconstruction. You know, I don't know if it scares them because how thick it is. You know, I'm not sure what it is, right? But it's like, oftentimes I talk to my students, if they were ever introduced to Du Bois, is sections from Souls of Black Folk, which is good, but it's not enough, right? For me, it's kind of like someone that reads Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, but never reads Wretched of the Earth, right? It's like you're only reading this one, but you're not reading this Du Bois. You're reading this Du Bois, not this one, all right? And so I think it's really useful to think about the importance of Du Bois, not just as a scholar, but his actions as an internationalist. And the same thing with Amílcar Cabral as an internationalist. If you read his work, he's always talking about being in solidarity with people in Korea, with people in Vietnam, the people's war in Vietnam, right? People in Cuba and Latin America. And so as scholars, as folks that are involved in the world, we need to think about how their actions, who they were, and their relationships to the people, right? So I think that's an important reflection on thinking about Du Bois and how he is understood in even the United States, right? But I think also I do want to take close what Antonio says in his paper about like being careful of what oftentimes American studies does, right? That we use the history of the US to understand the rest of the world. It's like, be careful with that, right? Because we're always critiquing US imperialism, but in a way that's almost reinscribing US imperialism when we're only thinking through the mindset of the empire, right? So being careful of reading others. So I think, reading, like you just mentioned, right, reading scholars from Africa, reading scholars from India, right, and then on their own analysis. I have a paper where I incorporate an analysis of proletarian feminism from an Indian activist to understand Central America, right? It's like, how do we do that? How do we engage different ideas from around the world to understand other places? And not just within the United States, right? And obviously that takes more work, and obviously that takes more of an internationalist training, but it's very useful for our scholarship and our activism, and as Mamadou was bringing up, right, the importance of tying it to the conditions of our locations and how people are writing about them. So I really think Du Bois, and I appreciate this event, but just this initiative, right, of really centering this book, right, Black Reconstruction, because there's so much to learn from it. It's just so dense with so much information, to study the police, to study the schooling system, right, to study the general strike, right? And he has one section in which chapter 10, right, where it talks about the idea that the record of the Negro worker during Reconstruction presents an opportunity to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state, right? So it's like, again, even that right there, right, the idea of studying the Marxist theory of the state through Black Reconstruction. Maybe that's why no one wants to read it, because it's like, the anti-communism in academia. But I think that's an important reflection there.
Well, thank you so much. I think that was a great way to wrap things up. This has been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much, Antonio, for such a fantastic talk, thinking through Reconstruction across Portugal and the US in such a really nuanced and brilliant way. And thank you so much, Stephen, for your beautiful engagement with all of this. It's really been delightful to hear the dialogue that you have generated, and want to thank also the audience for your attendance and your brilliant questions, and wish we could see you all in person, but so grateful that we can bring people from across the time zones together to share in this work. So thank you so much.
Thank you.